The words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. What does man gain by all the toil at which he toils under the sun? Vanity of vanities, says the preacher, all is vanity. The end of the matter, all has been heard. Fear God and keep his commands. This is the whole duty of man. We're starting a brand new series today, a series in the book of Ecclesiastes, looking at this Old Testament book, and we're going to begin on Sunday mornings working our way through this book together. It is a phenomenal book that deals with these topics. These verses that we've just looked at are the way that the writer of Ecclesiastes starts the book and ends the book, dealing with the questions of the significance of our lives. How much of your life is spent chasing after the wind? How much energy? How much anxiety? Think about the things that you were so anxious about a year ago and that at this point no longer matter at all. Think about the things that took all of your attention and energy 5 years ago or 10 years ago. What is the point of all that you do? Of all your hustling? What's the point? What's the end game? Do you like to people watch? You ever do that? I enjoy that sometimes. Very often when my wife is shopping, perhaps, and I'll be sitting on the bench, which is like the secret move of all husbands, right? If the store has somewhere to sit, I love that store much more because I can sit and she can shop, and I'm okay if I'm sitting. But I'll sit and just watch people go by, right? You've done this before. Just people watch, right? Watch people shop, watch people talk, watch people walk around. Or similarly, often when I'm driving, right, and you look around and just see cars whirling in every direction, everybody, and you think about this sort of big reality that all of these people, every single one of them has their entire whole world, has their whole life, has their whole history, their whole past, their whole family, their whole problems, their whole struggles, their whole world that they're going to, the whole world they're coming from, their jobs, their dreams, their goals, their aspirations. They're all hustling in one direction or the other, driving past me in one direction or the other, all trying to get somewhere, all aiming at something. And the question that Ecclesiastes wants you to stop and ask, really to pause and ask, is what for? Why? Everyone on their way quickly to something or somewhere, to what end? How many things that are on your mind right now as you're watching this, right, the things that have occupied your mind so far today, how many of them will be significant in just a year? Much less 5 years or 10 years or longer. How many things that are on your mind today aren't nearly as big of a deal as you've made them to be? Really? Ultimately, what thing is going on in your life? Are you really giving too much priority, too much anxiety, too much stress, too much time, too much energy? What's the point of it all? This book is one of my favorites, largely because of its continual, persistent relevance to every passing culture, right? Are you stressed? Ecclesiastes. Are you anxious? Ecclesiastes. Are you bored? Ecclesiastes. Are you lethargic? Ecclesiastes. Are you depressed? Ecclesiastes. It has eternal, really, and deep significance to all of us in the lives that we are constantly living, and all the things that constantly move our minds from one thing to another, like we're doing a connect the dot chart. We just move from one thing to the next and one thing to the next without ever pausing to stop. What exactly is the picture that I'm drawing? I hope you'll be reading this book along with me as we study it. The plan is to move through it chronologically, basically to move through the big sections of Ecclesiastes. I'm not sure how many weeks it'll take. Most scholars divide it up into about 13 or 14 sections. I don't know if it's going to take that long. I don't know if it will take longer. I will know on Monday what my lesson will be about next week, or as I begin studying, to see how these sections sort of fit together. And we'll see. Next week I'm planning on doing chapters 1, verses 1 through 11, which is pretty widely considered the first section. But very often as I get into studying, I will see there's more than I can cover in a week, or that I can add another section in 1 week. So I hope you'll be reading along with me, studying along with me, that we'll do this together. and hear the word of the Lord for us today from this book of Ecclesiastes and all the weeks to come. A little bit of logistics. Most think Solomon wrote Ecclesiastes, which he may have, but we don't know for sure. What we do know is that we are introduced to the main speaker of the book as the preacher, right? The words of the preacher. The words of the preacher. This is the way we are introduced to the main speaker, is he's called the preacher or the teacher or the philosopher. Depending on what version you use, it's different words saying this is the words of and the Hebrew word is kohelet. That's the Hebrew word, kohelet. This word in Greek, and from the Septuagint, is the word Ecclesiastes, which is where we get, of course, the name for this book, which comes from the Greek word, which you're maybe familiar with, ecclesia, which is the word used throughout the New Testament for church, which means assembly. And so it's this idea that is tied into this main speaker. Okay, so Kohelet is the assembler, or the one who is probably in front of the assembly, which is why preacher is probably a pretty good idea. But it's this idea of the people of God being assembled together to hear these words, the people of God listening to the words of God, right? So the words of Kohelet, the words of Ecclesiastes, the words that belong to the ecclesia, that belong to the assembly. These are the words for the people of God. Now, again, Kohelet is probably not the author, but he is sort of a character in the story, a main character in the story, the main speaker in the story. And we know that because the book begins by saying, these are the words of the preacher. These are the words of Kohelet. And then in the end, he summarizes it by saying the preacher said thus and thus. So it's like the author is giving us primarily the words of Kohelet, the words of the preacher, the words of the teacher, the words of the philosopher. So the author has some editorializing in the book where he makes sort of his own statements, but mainly what we have in Ecclesiastes is the author presenting us with the teachings of Kohelet, the teachings of the preacher. Now, all I want to do today is introduce you to the big themes in this book that we'll be filling in as we go, okay? Introducing you to the big themes that we'll be filling in as we go. Firstly and majorly is this: we, humanity, want control. We want control. And we cannot have it, right? That's the main issue being dealt with in Ecclesiastes at the foundation. We as humanity want control, but we cannot have it. The main obstacle to living well in the world is that mortal beings, us, those of us who live and die, everything but God, consistently, persistently refuse to accept our mortality and our finitude. We refuse to accept that we are temporary, that we will die, and that we have really very little impact over things or control over things that are going on in reality. It drives us insane that we have such little control over the things that are occurring. Kohelet sets out to convince the reader of our finitude, of our smallness, of our lack of control, even though we trick ourselves into thinking that we have some. The Bible sets the entirety of human existence within the context of a failed human attempt to become like God. Right, so the Bible sets our entire story within this. The narrative is the human attempt to become like God. That's how the story begins, and the whole story really is our attempt to be like God. Right? You think back from those words to the devil in the Garden of Eden saying, you will be like God. Eat of this fruit, you will know good and evil, and you will be like God. The same temptation that caused the devil to fall, he turns on Adam and Eve with, and it works. It is the human attempt to be like God. Now, this idea of being like God doesn't mean that we want to be like really shiny, right? That we want to be really big. The fact that in us, this heart of rebellion of wanting to be like God is that mainly that we want control. Mainly that we want control. We're not satisfied with the kind of freedom that God has given us. We want the freedom that God alone has. Ultimate freedom. Absolute freedom. control over all things, control over our lives, over our futures, over our loved ones, over our safety, over our finances, over our security, over our relationships. We want control. We want the kind of control that God has, absolute and real and utter control. The problem in our existence derives chiefly from this lack of control and chiefly from a refusal on our end to accept the divinely ordained boundaries. A refusal to accept the divinely ordained boundaries. We see that God has placed fences around us, which he has, which he did in the Garden of Eden and has done ever since. We see that God has placed fences around us, and we think that that means God is holding out on us, right? That out there is things that are even better if we could just go outside of the fences of God. But of course, the opposite is true. And again, we get it honest, right? Remember in the Garden of Eden when Adam and Eve were given this certain sort of freedom, right? Really massive freedom where they could eat of any tree in the garden, any tree in the garden. There was only fences in that sense around one tree. They couldn't eat of one tree of the garden. They had they had large freedom, real freedom, but not absolute freedom. There was one tree of which they could not eat, and yet that wasn't enough freedom for them. They wanted more control, and we are the same way, right? We get it honest. We get it from our ancestors. We get it from Adam and Eve. We want absolute freedom. We want absolute control. The devil says, you will be like God, knowing good and evil. And Eve says, that's the pathway to more control, to being like God. I will know more. I will have more control. Imagine if you lived out in the boondocks, as they say, and there were known to be wolves around your area, the land that you own, right? And you're 50 miles away from the nearest neighbor or civilization, and there's known to be dangerous animals, wolves that roam the area around your home. And so you build a large, very big, very substantial fence around your property. And you have children, and the children like to play outside, and you allow them to go play outside, and you just tell them, of course, just stay in the fence. Nothing is getting in this fence. Just stay in this fence, and you will be safe. You can do whatever you want in the fence, right? And so you have playgrounds inside the fence. It's like a park there's swimming pool, and there's a lake where they can fish, and there's all kinds of great things for the children to enjoy that you have given them to enjoy inside of that fence. And so you say, look, you have freedom to choose anything you'd like to do inside the fence, inside the backyard. Have a good time. Enjoy the things that I have given you with the intention of you enjoying them. Just stay inside the fence. What do? What do the children do? The children start wondering, because they get it honest, what's beyond the fence, and thinking, surely whatever's beyond that fence must be better than what is in this fence. The children start getting upset. Why do my parents get to decide where I stay? Why do they have control and I don't get control? They are limiting our freedom. They are limiting our choice. It's wrong. It's wrong for them to limit our freedom in any sense. We are to have absolute choice. We are to have absolute freedom. I want it. I deserve to go wherever I want to go. I get to control these decisions. It's me. You don't get to control these decisions. I get that sort of freedom. I get that sort of control. But I know as the parent that as soon as they leave that fence, it will lead to their absolute and utter demise. Whether by animal or otherwise. Now, am I, the parent, limiting their freedom? Yeah, I am. Now, they have total freedom of what they'd like to do inside the fence. Freedom to choose, decide, play, love, jump, swim. But their freedom has boundaries. Their control has boundaries for their good. Humanity, since the beginning, has hated those boundaries. Convinced that God is holding out on us, wanting ultimate freedom, wanting ultimate control over our own lives. The issue is control. That kind of control is just not something that God has granted you. He has granted you much, so much, but not control. He alone has that, and he alone is capable of doing the right thing with it. That's the world you want, right? You want the world where God has control. Because if you're in a world where really you have control, if you have total control, the kind of control that we want down deep, if we have total control, then God does not have it. That's terrifying. And if God has total control, then we do not have it. Those are the two world options. Which one would you prefer? It is against this background that Kohelet speaks, seeking to persuade his hearers of the futility of this ongoing human quest for control, and thus to save them from a life that is itself destined by futility. We want control, and we cannot have it. And it drives us nuts. Secondly, all is hevel. All is hevel. Ecclesiastes 1. Hevel of hevel is really what it says. Hevel is the Hebrew word there. Hevel of hevel, says the preacher. Hevel of hevel. All is hevel. What does man gain by all the toil at which he toils under the sun? And then he finishes the book by saying the same thing. All is hevel. 38 times. 38 times in this book, the word hevel is used as a key metaphor, and it's a picture. The word hevel is a picture. It's translated vanity in the version I read. It's translated meaningless, I believe, in the NIV, and in other translations, it's that idea of vanity, meaningless. But hevel is a picture word that is difficult to describe with just words, right? Because the word itself literally means vapor. That's what the word means, or breath, right? Just smoke in the air that dissipates quickly. Breath in the air that dissipates quickly. Some have said it's like the idea, it even was used for like a soap bubble that floats in the air and then pops out of nowhere and exists for almost no time at all. So it has this idea, the word hevel, this idea of vapor, it has this idea of being temporary and fleeting, right? It doesn't last long. It is there for a moment and then fades away. So that's there in the idea of hevel. But also in the idea of hevel that I think is missed with the idea of the word meaningless and vanity, also is that that life is a paradox that, like smoke, appears to be grabbable, right? Appears to be graspable, appears solid, something we could hold on to, we could wrap our minds around, that we could get control of in that sense, right? You see smoke, you see vapor, you see a cloud, and you want to grab it, right? You feel like you can reach out and hold it so that you can control it. But you reach out to grab it, and of course you're grabbing nothing. It cannot be grasped. It cannot be grabbed. Life is that way, that you think you can grab it, but then you reach out and you just can't, right? So often we think we get a grasp on the world, on reality, on how things work, right? Proverbs teaches that. A lot of people think, by the way, that Kohelet is in a lot of ways responding to Proverbs, saying that Proverbs are good, but it's not always that simple, right? Proverbs says, if you do good, you get good. And so you think, okay, you do good things, you get good things. That's something I can grab. I grab onto that. But then you do good and you get bad. Right? You reached out to grab it thinking, okay, I've got a hold on it. I've got a control of reality. If I do good, I get good. I know how these things work. But then it happens that you do good and you don't get good. And you get bad. Right? Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he gets old, he will not depart from it. Right? A popular proverb. So you hear that and you think, okay, all right, I can get a hold on that. Right? I can grab onto that. If I train up my child in the way he should go, when he gets old, he will not depart from it. And so you do that. Right? And it goes well. And then one time you train up a child in the way he should go, and when he gets older, he departs from it. Right? You thought you had a grasp on it, right? You thought you knew how it worked. You reached out to grab it, thinking you had control, and then realized that really you had no control. That it wasn't nearly as grabbable as you thought it was. Right? Parenting is a good way of thinking about this very often. For instance, Cohen, my fourth child, is 3 currently, has been great, right? Has been perfect and kind and obedient and positive and loving until like 3 months ago, right? And so I had this idea that I was like, okay, it took 4 kids, but we figured it out, right? Like this idea that we figured out this parenting thing, right? That I feel like I'm grabbing it, we know how to do it. We know what to do discipline-wise. We know what to do. How to spend our time with them, what books to read with them, how to structure our things. We know the proper way to make a good kid, right? We've grasped it, right? We've held on to it. And then the last couple of months, he's just been basically a royal turd, right? He's been difficult. He's been whiny and difficult. And in fact, all 4 of our kids have been differently difficult. It's like the moment you think you got it, you're reminded very clearly, you don't got it. You're doing your best. I mean, I'm doing my best. We're doing our best, me and Ariel, but we don't got it. We're not in control of whether or not our kids end up good. We play some role, but ultimately, we're not in control. One of my favorite stories from my childhood is my parents' closest friends when I was real young was this family called the Williams family. And the Williams had 2 children. We had 2 children as well. We had some foster kids in there, but Caleb and I were mom and dad's. And Caleb, my brother, you know him. He's been a member here for about a year or something like that, 6 months. It was a difficult child, right? He was difficult. Of course I wasn't. Of course I was an angel, but Caleb was a difficult child. He was, you know what I mean. He was just difficult kid. And the Williams' oldest 2, Kyle and Ashley, were, like me, perfect. They were great. Good kids. Just like Luann says, who I love, says they had the gift of obedience, right? Just obedient and enjoyed obeying. And we're good kids, and we're sweet and kind and all those things. And so Caleb would be difficult, right? While we were at their house, while we were playing, and there were these times where the parents would come to my parents, and they would say, it's really all in the parenting, dealing with Caleb. It's really all in the parenting. If you would just do things the way that we do things, right? I mean, look at Kyle and look at Ashley. They're perfect. They're great. If you would just do things the way we do things, really, he would be better. And so mom and dad just kind of swallowed their pride, They love these people. It's their friends. And then, they don't want to say, well, if we've parented Renee and Caleb both the same way, they've ended up very differently. I don't. And then, by the grace of God, very humorously, the Williams had another child, a third child, Michael, who made Caleb look like the saint of all saints, right? was like convinced he was a bulldog for like a year and a half and just like barked and bit and like was just insane, right? Crazy kid. Awesome. Also, I love this family. Awesome family. Awesome. But the kid was nuts. And the Williams, a couple of years into his existence, into his life, come to mom and dad and say, we're sorry. We were so dumb. We had no idea. we thought we had a grasp on it, right? We thought we had a control of it. We thought, and so we were shaming you for something that you know. This is what we do, right? In humanity, is we try to get a grasp on life, and we think we have control of it, and then as soon as we do, we realize we just don't. Right? You've had that happen where you think you have a grasp of something, and then something happens and throws your confidence all out the window, thinking you had control of it, and you just don't. We try to solve this uncontrollability in a couple main ways that Kohelet focuses on, which we'll spend, of course, a lot of time on in the coming weeks. But I'm already longer than I intended to be, so we'll just save this for future weeks. But the main message that I want you to hold on to as we begin this series is this, that we want control and we just can't have it, that everything indeed is hevel of hevels, that everything we feel like we can control, we can't really control. And this, of course, is true also and chiefly, in a lot of ways, of our salvation, right, of Christianity. We think that the way our salvation works, at least in the beginning, that we think, and still, even as Christians, we constantly have this bubble up inside of us, that we really have a grasp on how on our salvation, that really we control it, right? That really it's like this transaction that we pay our part and then God gives us back salvation. But that's not the biblical picture of salvation. And the biblical picture is that God gives it to you as his gift by his grace, and that all we do is respond to it. That salvation, that you're being right with God, is not something that really you control. It is a gift given entirely by God, and it's just something we respond to in faith. Our life as a Christian, we want to have a grasp on it. We want to control where it goes and how things go and where things go and all this stuff. And we just can't. It's just a life of trusting in God, of saying, I cannot grasp mentally what God is doing in my life and why he is doing things this way. It is smoke. It is vapor. I can't get a hold on it, but I just trust him. I can't control my being right with God, my salvation with God in that sense. I just have to accept the gift of God. I just have to trust God. I just have to submit to God. So often we are like a child who gets on a roller coaster and just cries the whole time, even though it's this great roller coaster, should be having a lot of fun, should be enjoying it as the gift that it is. He's just angry the whole time because he can't control which direction the roller coaster is going to go. There's going to be some ups, there's going to be some downs, and the child, poor child, has no control about when they come and how they come and how steep they are, how scary they are. He just doesn't have control. This is the message of Ecclesiastes in a lot of ways is, listen, you're kind of just on the ride. You have to come to the realization that you don't have control. There's going to be some ups. There's going to be some downs. It's inevitable. Accept the hevel. Accept the hevel. Lean into Christ. Bow to Christ. Submit to Christ. Lean on him entirely for salvation. He is the only one that's in control. Love you, church. Talk to you soon.